Okay, so good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. So we're very happy today as part of our lecture series open to HNC and the rest of SAIS to have Dr. Dominic Ma speaking. He is a political economist who's been quite engaged with China over the years. His first trip was during the first SARS epidemic in 2003. He's been studying the epidemiology, policy response, and economics of COVID throughout the pandemic. He completed his PhD at Australian National University, where he was a Rio Tinto China scholar. He's also worked in think tanks in Beijing, Hong Kong, Canberra, and Sydney as an economist at the Reserve Bank of Australia, and ran the Australia-China Youth Dialogue. He's currently the director of the Australasia Strategy Group, which conducts research analysis and advocacy on major strategic issues affecting the Indo-Pacific region. And today his topic that he's going to talk about is vaccine diplomacy and the emerging conflict between democracies and autocracies. So Dominic, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much. I thought I might begin by just mentioning why I got interested in this so early in SARS-2. You know, as you mentioned, my first trip to China was during SARS-1. I sort of arrived there for the very first time, fresh out of undergraduate on Valentine's Day in 2003, and you know, we were sort of studying there for a while, and then it all sort of blew up and very confusing. There was no information. You know, the only information you had back then was, you know, no smartphones or anything like that, but just internet cafes, which were the first thing to be closed. And you know, my perspective of that was, I saw all these things happening that seemed crazy, and you know, it seemed like the risk of getting this virus back then was so low. You know, there was a couple of hundred cases in a population of millions, and you know, the thing I was worried about then was what the government was doing. And so, you know, I had this sort of long experience with that back then as a very naive, foolish young person who made all the same kind of mistakes that a lot of young people these days are making in SARS-2. And I look back on that time and I sort of think, how embarrassing. You know, I was one of those people. But you know, when SARS-2 came along, I was just preparing to go back to China for another trip, and so I was paying very close attention to it from early in January because I was going to determine if I had to cancel my trip, which I did. But you know, it was one of those things I sort of thought from about the 5th of January, this is going to be a really big issue that, you know, I'll pay attention to and be able to be an expert on, and no one else will be noticing it, and I'll be the expert. I was right, there was a big deal. I didn't quite expect it to be this big of a deal. I thought it'd be really a China-sized deal. And you know, it really blew up in a way that I think, well, obviously everyone hoped it wouldn't. But you know, then more recently, we were sort of, I think I was discussing with you about the vaccine diplomacy issues, and you know, China had introduced a few weeks ago on the 12th of March, last over a month ago now, this policy of recognizing for visa purposes people that had only China-made vaccines. And you could come to China on an expedited visa if you're vaccinated with a Chinese-made vaccine, which are generally not available outside of China. You know, so it was a very inconvenient policy. And you know, this started this well, for us, I think, this conversation about vaccine diplomacy. And I described that particular policy as you know, blatantly discriminating between vaccines for national political advantage, and thought of it as one of the least helpful ideas that have been going around in a year of very unhelpful ideas. So that's sort of how I came to, this interest in the vaccine diplomacy specifically. And the more I've been thinking about it quite a bit since then, and my approach to it is to break it up into essentially a story with 3 chapters. And for me, the beginning of this it all begins with a lot of colossal stuff-ups. China sort of stuffed up first. Trump followed pretty quickly afterwards. Europeans managed to do not very much better. And the first sort of phase was just everyone making terrible mistakes. The next part was all the attempts to recover, and that's where the sort of international diplomacy comes in. It began with the mask diplomacy. Later, when vaccines were available, it's turned into vaccine diplomacy. And then those efforts have sparked responses to those efforts. And so China's gone and done their vaccine diplomacy moves, and other people have reacted to that, trying to counter the moves, and you've got this sort of tit for tat kind of diplomatic dance going on. So that's sort of how I think of it in broad strokes. Is this this beginning context, the attempt to recover, and then everyone responding to each other's attempts. But so I'm actually intending, I think, the part of this I think is least understood generally is, why it's so important to China. Right? Why did they have to make this recovery? Why do they have to put so much effort into it? And for me, as a political economist and not as a vaccinologist or a virologist or epidemiologist, the context is China's political system. And so I want to discuss a bit how their political system has sort of demanded that they do this. And then, at the end we might discuss a little bit, some of what other countries have done in response if there's time. But I wanted to also, before I get into exactly all that, I wanted to bring up the current epidemiology and status of vaccinations. Just because sometimes we don't pay attention to the headline figures for a couple of weeks and they change pretty quickly. It's been we're 16 months in since the world became aware of SARS-CoV-2, and in that amount of time, 124 million people have become infected. 3 million people now have died. The US and the EU have each had just about a quarter of the world's infections. As of this week, almost 900,000 people are being infected every day, and 15,000 people are dying every day from COVID. The pandemic right now is not getting better, it's getting worse. If you're in the US, it looks like it's getting better because in the US, the vaccines are going fairly well. The number of daily infections has fallen from 250,000 a few weeks ago down to about 60,000, I think now. But across the world, the pandemic is still getting worse. But in terms of vaccinations, 525 million people have been vaccinated with at least 1 dose, and almost 1 billion doses have been administered around the world, 950 million, which I just find incredible. There's a bunch of different vaccines obviously in use with different technologies. I think, but only 3 seem to have been approved by the WHO for I think they call emergency use. That's the Pfizer, the Oxford AstraZeneca, and the Johnson & Johnson. And those are all US and UK, EU virus vaccines. There's a handful of vaccines in circulation or in distribution from China, I think 4. There's 1 from Russia. India is producing their own vaccine. India is also producing the AstraZeneca vaccine, and their manufacturing of that has also been approved by the WHO. So there's quite a lot of vaccines in this, being distributed. At the beginning of the year, in the beginning of the pandemic, I should say, there was a lot more. I think there was well over 100 vaccine candidates. One from Queensland University. Australia had one vaccine being developed at, I think, Queensland University. It might have been Queensland University of Technology. And recently it came out that that had proved almost 99% effective. But there had been a problem with it, that it was causing false positive AIDS diagnoses. And so, it was essentially, it was making it look like people had AIDS when they didn't. So we had this very effective vaccine that they unfortunately scrapped because, you might not think that's a problem, but if you actually need to diagnose AIDS accurately, then that suddenly becomes a problem. And of course, there's been so many other vaccine candidates that I think they thought, well, we're going to lose this one and we'll rely on the others. There've been many vaccines in Australia. We've been using mostly, well, we've been barely started, to be honest, but the plan has been to be using mostly the AstraZeneca. Some of the recent developments around blood clots has thrown that into a bit of a tailspin, and they're introducing a lot more of the Pfizer vaccine eventually, maybe this year, we'll see. That's sort of where we are. Around the world, the US has done more vaccines than anyone, comfortably over 200 million now. India seems to be doing the fastest at the moment. India has vaccinated 100 million people in the last 7 weeks, which again, I just find this absolutely astounding. That kind of organizational effort, to get that out in such a rapid pace. China also seems to be doing a lot of vaccines, but the data they're producing, there seems to be some issue with it. So I haven't got a confident reading on how many vaccinations China's actually done, but some data I've seen puts it around the same level as the US, and most of that's been in the last 6 or 7 weeks, coming up to around 200 million. If that's accurate, that's very impressive. And then it comes down to other small countries like the UK have done about 50 million, which is much higher as a percentage of their population, but it's a smaller number overall. So that's, and of course Israel has done, the most astounding sort of feat. That's kind of where we are with the epidemiology of the virus and with the vaccinations in a sort of general global sense. Just to, if people are watching this in the future, they can know what the current context is, or if people are watching it now and haven't reminded themselves, they can be reminded. But in that context, then why is all this vaccinations becoming such a diplomatically contested issue? For me, this begins with China, and you see sometimes people put an explanation in relation to debt trap diplomacy. My view is forget about debt traps. If your strategy is to lend something to someone that they won't be able to repay you, so you've lost it, that seems like a very bad strategy to me. I don't think I don't think that's what they're interested in, lending things just to lose them. But you can influence people without losing your assets. So for China, people talk about that. I think that's a red herring. Much more important for China is legitimacy. I think it's about domestic legitimacy. It's about dominance in international relations, in bilateral relations, and their global position, and it's about control. So what do I mean by all that? The context here is China's political system. And to understand why legitimacy is such an important issue for China, you can just contrast it with our political system. I mean, our governments, the US, the UK, Australia, wherever, the government gets its legitimacy through elections. The basis of their right to govern is they present themselves to the public as a potential government. The public chooses which team they want to endow with the sort of limited rights to govern, and then that gives them the legitimacy to govern for a fixed period of time. China doesn't have that system. Instead, China has what Max Weber described as performance legitimacy. If an old school Orientalist might call it the mandate of heaven. But performance legitimacy basically means if you're doing a good job and you keep doing a good job, then you've demonstrated your legitimacy and you're allowed to carry on. And so the risk with that kind of system is that you're constantly on a precipice, or you've constantly got this sort of Damocles hanging over you, where if you're not doing a good job, you lose your legitimacy. And the definition of a good job is subjective. And so under Mao, the deal was independence. Right? Mao sort of stood up, or at least that's the myth. He sort of threw off the colonial shackles and China became independent. Then you had under Deng, China became rich. And that was the sort of new contract. Right? The CCP would lead China and China would get rich. And so for years we had these GDP growth targets with local officials being promoted based on GDP figures. That kind of continued under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao. And the idea, one of the ideas was that if growth fell below sort of 6%, they wouldn't be able to generate enough jobs and they'd lose the legitimacy and be overthrown. So their sort of Weberian performance legitimacy was depending on getting rich. And now we have Xi, and under Xi, there's a new contract, and legitimacy in China now for the government is based on getting strong. Now you hear China talking about being a strong major country, right? Strong power. And that is sort of the context or the basis that we gives rise to all this wolf warrior diplomacy. It's why China sort of from the outside often seems to act irrationally, because the most important thing for the Chinese government is not that they have friendly relations with other countries, but that they convince the average Chinese people that China's strong under Xi's leadership. And so they have to act strong, or at least they have to act in a way that they think looks strong. And so often that comes across from our perspective as belligerent and irrational and bizarre. But from their perspective, there's a rational motivation for it. And their whole sort of national narrative is oriented towards this, the centuries of humiliation, the patriotic education, the insistence on loyalty to the party everywhere. A big part of this is about projecting competence and strength. And then along comes COVID. And that messes up completely this narrative of a strong, rejuvenated country that's taking its place back in the world. Because COVID, if you remember back to the beginning of the pandemic, the very beginning of the pandemic, when it was just known by a handful of doctors sending each other messages on WeChat, and they were saying, there's a novel pneumonia, and we think it looks like SARS. And SARS in China had represented this weakness, this vulnerability and humiliation, essentially, because it made China look backward. It was a sort of, this is not a very PC sort of way to describe it, but it was a kind of peasant's disease. It came from animals, right? People interacting with livestock. It was a sort of a weak, backward thing that in a sort of Chinese mindset. And now, after 20 odd years of growth and development, they're right back at this same point. And this SARS again. And it's not at all the image of shining skyscrapers and advanced technology and aircraft carriers that the CCP is trying to project. So their whole sort of story is of legitimacy is coming crashing down back in January and February. And if you remember, if you were following back then what was happening on Wuhan, and if you have access to Chinese social media, you could see people were angry, really angry. It almost came to revolt. People were putting videos saying down with the CCP, and they were doing it with their real name. You know, I remember one guy who had his official government ID with his, with his ID number visible, and he was saying, overthrow the CCP. This kind of thing would never have happened in any other context, I think. But it was around that time, and when the Dr. Li Wenliang had died, and Wuhan was in this state of mourning, and all of China seemed to be in this state of anger and mourning. But people were crying out the balconies. It got very nearly lost control, or at least from the perspective of the central government, that's what it looked like. That they were on a sort of precipice of losing control. For them, I think it was basically a near-death experience, and based on this complete demolishing of their narrative of strength and competence. Instead, it looked corrupt because it had been a cover-up at the beginning that arrested the guy who had brought to light everything. And how could this hopeless government ever restore China's sort of rightful glory? So everything is sort of spinning out of control in China. And that really lasted up until March 10th, I think, when Xi Jinping went to Wuhan finally. He waited, he was kind of in hiding for weeks. Eventually Wuhan had managed to get control of the virus. And that's when he rocked up to sort of declare mission accomplished. And it really had vibes, in my view, of George Bush on an aircraft carrier declaring mission accomplished. Because you just knew that it wasn't. Right? There was no way that they'd gotten every last speck of this virus. But here he is in his hotel room with a big TV and it's a huge empty room with just him standing in the middle. But the video is sort of set up to make it look like he's among the people. And here he is saying, congratulations, Wuhan, we did it. From there, from that sort of March 10th moment onwards, it had started with the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission, and then once they confirmed that this was out of control and human transmission, on January 21st, it got elevated to the Municipal Health Commission, and then on March 10th, Xi Jinping arrived, and the whole thing went from we've now controlled the virus, now we're controlling the narrative. That became the mission. It was, the first part was done. Now we had to recreate this sense of we're in control. We didn't fail. We succeeded, and that's when you start getting this these weird stories about how maybe the virus didn't come from Wuhan at all. Maybe it came from America through the military games, or maybe it came from Norway on frozen salmon, or maybe it came from Australia on frozen beef. And don't worry that none of these places have outbreaks. I mean, SARS is this disease this virus it's not subtle, right? If you've got it, it gets everywhere. It explodes very, very quickly. You would know if you had an epidemic. But forget about that. These countries are too old and stagnant and in decline to notice. Right? We were the first country to realize that, to find the virus. It didn't start here, but we found it. This is this kind of gaslighting of the world. Right? And this rewriting the history of the epidemic, of the pandemic, I should say, to fit it back into this narrative of China being the country that, not the country that caused the pandemic, but the country that stopped the pandemic, the country that helped everyone, saved everyone. And this sort of became the narrative. And it wasn't Wuhan people who were suffering greatly because of mismanagement and incompetence and corruption. It was Wuhan people had pitched in together, and they were all national heroes. that sacrificed and saved the world. That was the narrative that they turned it into, and it was incredibly successful. Right? They're very good at this, and so this is when the sort of diplomacy part of it kicks in as well. Right? You have the story has to include in this stage this sense that China is out there saving other countries from the virus, right? They were the ones that found it. Now they're the ones that are helping other countries deal with it. And of course, by this stage, Europe is was completely out of control. The US was beginning to get out of control. And so it was a pretty compelling narrative, to be honest. There was an element of truth in it. China had contained the virus, and the countries that were expected to contain the virus were failing to. And so what did they do? They started with mass diplomacy. And this is the sort of precursor to the vaccine diplomacy. You have, when the virus was mostly in Wuhan, China sort of SOEs and diaspora all sort of mobilized to send PPE back to Wuhan. And then when the virus was everywhere else, they started this campaign to send it around the world, back around the world. That went very badly because they had this business of they'd sell the masks, but they wouldn't set up government procurement contracts. They'd sell them sort of person to person through WeChat, and they'd present it as though it was a gift, and governments would have to come and supplicate themselves at the airport and thank you, China, for saving us with your generous bounty of PPE. And then when you open the packet, they're all defective, and they're not sanitized. Some of them have been used before. It was a complete schmozzle, and it contributed hugely to the collapse in public perceptions of China around the world. This backfired externally. It backfired hugely, and you can see that in Pew Research survey data, where just about every country's perception of China collapsed. Not from the beginning of the virus, but seemingly from the government response after the virus had happened. Certainly that's what the case was in Australia. When the virus was in China, there was a big sort of solidarity, empathy phase where, the public buildings were all sort of lit up in red and gold, and, it was all, good luck China, and people would specifically go to Chinese restaurants to support local Chinese businesses because there was this fear, and there was this sort of solidarity period, even though people knew that it was becoming a pandemic, right? So it wasn't that people were blaming China for the virus at that stage, but then when we had border controls coming in and other things, and the Chinese government started attacking countries over it and calling them racist for having this kind of thing, right? The government's response is, I think, what created this big collapse in public perception. So in the UK as well, I remember they had this wasn't an official government statement, but I think maybe in the Global Times wrote an op-ed threatening to withhold PPE unless the UK agreed that Huawei could provide core 5G infrastructure. And this op-ed came out, I think, in the same week that half of Whitehall were in hospital with COVID. And so, having a gun pointed to their head, it really didn't go down well. I think one of the MPs wrote a sort of reply op-ed, basically demanding trillions of dollars of reparations. It was this all of this mass diplomacy backfired spectacularly in the rest of the world. Domestically, I think it went much better because they could present the parts that they wanted to present. Right? They could present the ceremonies, and they could present the statements saying they'd sent masks to all these countries, and it made China appear like they were the country that were in charge. They were the country that were capable, and they were playing the servant essentially to the rest of the world, being a good global citizen. Where am I? I'm a bit past my minutes. So that all sort of brings us finally up to the vaccine stage of this diplomacy effort. So China's trying to present itself as competent. Vaccines are a great tool for that. They're technically challenging. They're scarce. No one else has got them. China had quite a head start. One of their vaccines was the first, I think, to get to go through stage 2 trials. Frankly, they were doing quite well. It was a technology that they knew, at least not the mRNA vaccines, but I think they call it the more standard technology that people are more familiar with. This is it was seen as a sort of great opportunity for presenting themselves as global leaders and ingratiating themselves with other countries, right? In the moment of need, here's your salvation, essentially. So there was a big list of countries that they started sending vaccines to. One of the problems was for China that they'd controlled the virus. And if you're developing a vaccine, you need to test it on people. You can go through stage 1 and stage 2 trials with relatively small numbers of people. But if you want to go through a stage 3 trial, does it actually work in the public, in the community? You need to have a community that's experiencing, where the virus is circulating, in order to notice a statistical difference between vaccinated people and not vaccinated people. And there just wasn't enough virus circulating in China, so they couldn't actually test it domestically. They had to test it. They had to find partner countries to test it with. And so what that meant they were doing was sending out vaccine that was experimental. And you saw cases in, I'm going to forget if it's Indonesia or Papua New Guinea, but I think it was Indonesia, and they were using employees of SOEs essentially as guinea pigs for vaccine. That was really, there was no published data about the employees who were sort of locally employed people. There was no way they could give informed consent. They didn't know what they were being injected with, and whether it was safe. Maybe there was some question about, well, it had gone through safety trials, but it was a very sort of not rigorous approach to vaccines. It was essentially the opposite of what you see now with the blood clotting issue, right? Where there's X number of millions of vaccinations and 1 or 2 of them throw up a complication and we put the whole program on hold. This was the complete opposite of that approach, where it's don't really tell people what you're getting, but put it in them anyway, and treat them like a bit of a guinea pig. So I think in this sense, given how the mass diplomacy backfired externally, failed spectacularly based on sort of shoddy quality of product. If the vaccines are of equal sort of quality, I think you have a real potential problem with China's approach to this vaccine diplomacy. Because if people are getting vaccinated with defective vaccines, it's not just going to look bad for China, it potentially also throws up a risk of whether people are going to continue trusting vaccines in general, because not everyone is going to identify this is a Chinese vaccine versus this is some other vaccine. They're just going to say, we can't trust this kind of, these medical products. Many people won't be like that; they'll be more sophisticated. But I think it's a big risk if this is done in this sort of shoddy way. So where am I up to now? So we've got all of this going on. There's quite a few of China's got, I think I mentioned, 4 different vaccines. They're all produced by SOEs. You've got the CanSino Bio, Sinovac, Sinopharm. I think Sinopharm has 2. And they've been sending them to quite a lot of countries. Obviously, there's some part of it where they'll only send doses to countries that, for instance, not countries that recognize Taiwan at the UN, for instance. They'll preference countries that have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. So they're sort of pushing all their general diplomatic priorities along with it. And in some cases, they're also not just delivering vaccine and handing it off at the airport, but building the entire distribution network within the country. If the country doesn't have a good public health system or a good logistics distribution network, in some places we've seen China building the entire distribution system for vaccines. And I assume, although I haven't actually seen this reported, I assume that if they're running the vaccine distribution, that they're also collecting the health data, the patient health data that goes along with it. So, I think there's quite a lot of risks going along with these with this process, both for China and for the recipient countries. But the broader context of it is, first of all, the domestic process of establishing this sort of competency and legitimacy and reasserting the narrative. And then in the external side of things, you've got the process of ingratiating China with the other country, establishing a sort of a dependency or a superiority relationship, right, where China is in charge. It's always a sort of bilateral arrangement. China loves to say they're big fans of multilateralism, but really they tend to act mostly bilaterally because that's where they're always the larger party. And the CCP has a sort of addiction to control. So they're always working in a way that will establish this sort of imbalanced relationship. So a lot of this is a sort of where China's at with their vaccine diplomacy, in my view. They of course completely deny it. They've published op-eds in People's Daily saying, we would never do vaccine diplomacy. We're just supplying vaccines. It rings pretty hollow. Their denials are self-evidently not true on the facts, but whether they want to be true on the intention, maybe that's up to a perception. But that's sort of where China's been at. There's not much data about which countries are actually using Chinese vaccines. The only one I've seen is Chile, which has used 86% of Chile's vaccinations have been Sinovac and 14% have been Pfizer. But all the other countries I've seen actual data for using either Pfizer or AstraZeneca or the other one from the US. I forgot the name of it. Moderna. But there are other countries that are using it, but without publishing excellent data on it. So that's sort of where China's been at it with it. And I guess the last part really is how other countries have responded to that. The response, frankly, has been pretty muted, and I'm not sure how much you want to go into that now, or if you want to bring it over into, if you want to raise any questions. I mean,
yeah, we can open up. We can open up for some general questions, I guess, at this point. I mean, I think one interesting point that you mentioned was this sort of idea of China's narrative about not doing vaccine diplomacy or not politicizing. And I've heard this. I mean, since I came back to China in the last few weeks, I've heard people saying that America's failing was politicizing this, and we see all the Chinese media coverage about not politicizing COVID. I mean, when you see that kind of narrative, I mean, what does politicization actually mean to people who are using this kind of term? What does it mean to politicize and not to politicize something?
Sure. I mean, on one hand, I think that they're completely right that last year Trump absolutely politicized it. Right? Every moment, it wasn't about solving the problem; it was about casting blame. It was the Wuhan flu, the Kung flu, the China virus. Right? It wasn't about how do we stop the virus from infecting Americans. It was about how do we make sure that China gets the blame. And I think that's politicizing the virus for sure. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, I think the UN Security Council, I think, trying to pass a resolution about what to do, and it got held up for 2 weeks while they were arguing over whether to call it the China virus or something else. Right? I think nCoV or something like that at the time, novel coronavirus. I mean, what a waste of time, right? That the world needed. You've got your two biggest, most capable countries, frankly, that could be, the two countries that most are able to produce things like PPE, benched essentially, not helping the world because they're fighting over the name. That was just a real disgraceful period. And I mean, President Trump was all over that. Xi Jinping, and I mean, I've already talked about China's, the extent to which they politicized it, but the US, I think, was doing much the same. But because I focus on China, I talk about China. So I mean, yes, there was that. The other part of your question, I think, the comment that you responded to was sorry, which again?
Well, I think this point about that other countries are politicizing it and China is not. Because I think there's it's almost as if you look at the US probably was the most pronounced example of this, where you have these fault lines within society which already exist in terms of political, ideological, social values, and then these end up being mapped onto the controversy over how to respond to the pandemic, probably more than in a lot of other countries. I think in many places in the world, you may have seen a range of opinion on particular measures that were being taken to control it, but often these would be cross-cutting with other characteristics, other fault lines of society. Whereas I think in the US, it became sort of this line down the middle, which was lined up pretty much with this other dimension of political polarization. And then, so I think there has to be this kind of politicization over how people in society respond to this, how seriously they take it, what sort of measures by government they think are appropriate, and to some extent, whether they see this as something coming from outside, from China, or being more of a common global problem. It seems that the Chinese kind of politicization is more about, as you were saying, performance legitimacy, right? It's being used as a way of demonstrating the superiority of a certain kind of system's response to it. So it's different layers of what we do or don't refer to as politicization, perhaps. I was wondering, when you were talking about how other countries respond to this, I noticed you hadn't mentioned Russia at all, and Russia on a smaller scale seems to be engaging in a kind of vaccine diplomacy, or at least also seeking a sort of legitimacy or recognition from this. But at the same time, domestically, Russia has had quite a lot of cases, and in some ways seems to have taken a much laxer approach to how serious this is within Russia. I don't know if you have any thoughts about other countries politicizing this.
Russia is a bit harder for me to comment on because I don't spend a lot of time studying Russia. My sense is that Putin's handled it quite similar to the way Trump sort of handled it, I think. in many senses. He didn't want to control the virus, didn't want to sort of do the things that had to be done to stop people getting infected, just preferred to sort of control the public awareness of the problem. And that is easier to do in a country where you control all the media. In the US, obviously, it doesn't work very well because that a lot of voices get out no matter what you do. But I think that's largely what Putin tried to do. I mean, Russia's had a lot of political challenges this year that I think are unrelated to the pandemic. But Russia is really not my field, so I really comment too much about it.
It seems a lot less central in Russia as an issue than it is either in China or America or Europe or a lot of other places. I think, to the extent that the Sputnik vaccine may gain some kind of international legitimacy, it seems Putin is quite willing to make use of that to some extent, but it's not as central as a political symbol perhaps as in some other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think they've tried to do that. I mean, calling it Sputnik 5 is obviously a big sort of throwback to a powerful bygone period, but they don't seem to have followed up with, at least not yet, with the level of actual production that you've seen from China, from the US, the UK, Germany, Italy, and India. India is probably one of the big ones, to be honest. I mentioned that they've got one of the fastest, possibly the fastest vaccination program going at the moment. They've also passed vaccines, quite a few millions of vaccines to neighboring countries. And I think, Bhutan, for instance, we saw went from 0 to 100% of their country being vaccinated in the space of about 5 days. Bhutan obviously is a smaller challenge possibly than India. I think that was entirely vaccine delivered from India. Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, I think they've been receiving some from India as well. And there was, of course, the 6 or 7 weeks ago now, there was the Quad Summit, which turned into the Quad Vaccine Summit. With the US, India, Australia, and Japan, sort of getting together to discuss, how can we provide vaccines to countries to make sure that China's not getting all the credit, basically. Seemed to be how it went. And there was some announcement that was impressive that they got to the stage of having an announcement. I'm not sure actually how much that's actually delivered. I haven't seen it reported. So when I say I'm not sure, I'm honestly not sure. I suspect that, India's infection rate has just gone through the roof in the period since that summit. And I suspect that they're going to be focusing on using their vaccine capacity themselves. So maybe that's been delayed a bit while India gets on top of things. But the intention there was to be sending vaccine to Southeast Asia, especially, and to ASEAN, because I think that was seen as one of the regions where China is trying to get political influence and make it harder for, maybe solidify their control over South China Sea. Maybe is probably the concern. And if countries in ASEAN are amenable to that, then that makes it harder for other countries to access open sea lanes and potentially defend Taiwan if it comes to that. These kind of issues, I think, will get tied up ultimately in political support in the region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a slightly different question about legitimacy and public attitudes within China and the narrative internally, because I think one of the themes running throughout official Chinese media coverage of this over the last year has been that China has been so successful in stamping out community transmission internally, while the virus is raging around the world, and that this is a commentary on both the effectiveness of the Chinese state apparatus, but also this kind of psychological distinction between the safe inside and the dangerous outside. And if you look at the quarantine requirements and the travel restrictions on China, this whole combination of policies is a manifestation of that attitude towards the outside world as being a source of risk. Now, the internal sort of rollout of the Chinese vaccination program, I think, has been picking up pace. Just anecdotally, since I've been back in Nanjing, I've run into quite a number of people who've had the first dose, at least within the last couple of weeks. So I think the 200 million or whatever figure that you mentioned does seem pretty representative of what's happening. I've heard that, anecdotally, that some districts within Beijing and Shanghai actually have, I think, something like half of the population vaccinated already. So the rollout does seem to be gathering pace. But at the same time, most indications seem to be that the efficacy of the vaccines that are being used are actually not that high. But even with 2 doses, it's something like 50, 60%. And it may be very effective at preventing people getting serious cases requiring hospitalization, but it doesn't necessarily slow transmission or having mild symptoms as much as some of the other ones would. Now, I wonder if this poses an issue with the narrative, as we see some of the Chinese media talking about the need to reopen borders in coming months, sooner or later anyway, right? I think they have a sense that as the rest of the world is reopening, they don't want to fall behind with that, and that's a noticeable shift in discourse even in the last month or so. But then even with some level of herd immunity or mass vaccination, if you do open borders and then you get cases coming through, people will get mild cases. You may not be clogging up the hospitals with it, but you would then, I think, need to change the narrative from, we are protecting the public from this dangerous pandemic in the outside world, to you may get symptoms, you may know you have it, but it won't actually kill you. And it seems that is quite a shift of narrative that's going to have to happen, that the media is going to have to pivot on here. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how a reopening scenario interacts with this narrative about inside and outside and risk levels and performance.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm Australian, and border control is our main deal as well. Testing, but border control is the big deal. And my view is, from our perspective, for Australia, removing the need for quarantine, right? So when we start opening borders, I think what we're talking about is letting people come into the country without going through a 2-week quarantine on arrival. And because you have the 2-week quarantine requirement, there's a sort of cap on quarantine placements. So you have a very sort of slow flow of people coming in. In our case, very slow. Removing that, I think, before you have population immunity from vaccines wouldn't work, right? Because even if you have, the Pfizer vaccine is one of the best vaccines available, and its efficacy is supposedly around 95%. If you've got a plane load of 400 people, you're still talking about potentially 20 people on statistically that could be infected, right? Where in the 5% where the vaccine is not necessarily covering them as well as it could. So how that works out in practice as opposed to in statistics, I'm not quite sure, because I don't think there's been a plane load of 400 people for months. But the point is that if people are coming in, it only takes one case to get through, and you're away, right? You need to make sure that if people are coming in, you've got to make sure that the virus has nowhere to go, and that means you've got to have basically vaccinated. You've got to have achieved public and population immunity. If the efficacy of your vaccine is 50%, you can't do it. Even 100% vaccination rate won't give you population immunity. You really need the vaccine to be at least sort of 70-80% effective. There's a technical difference between those two that I'm not savvy on. In China's case, there's a second problem though, which is and we're experiencing that a bit as well. There's no sort of fear of the virus because it's under control. And so there's a big hesitancy to get vaccinated. You know, a lot of Chinese people are sort of saying, well, you know, why do I want this vaccine that I don't fully, it's a new product, I don't fully know that it's safe, you know, from my perspective, even if doctors are certain, and I don't really need it, right? What's the risk to me if I don't get it? And I think that's a common sentiment. I think it's the wrong sentiment to take, because, you know, from my perspective, the risk is not me dying of COVID. The risk is me living in a country where COVID is, me living in a country that's awash with COVID. But you don't want to live in a place where you can't walk down the street because everyone's afraid of dying. You know, it's not that you might die yourself necessarily, it's that it just is a crappy place to live if it's a sort of failed state. You can't go to hospital because they're all full of COVID patients. But you can't, you know, you don't want to live in that country. That's the risk. Right? It's, you know, so even if you're a young person, a 20-year-old, maybe you think the odds of serious disease is very low, but you need to not be a transmission vector if you want your community to be safe. But you need to be someone who blocks the virus if it gets to you, which means you need to be vaccinated, right? So that you can't pass it on and you know, potentially infect your family or your friends or, you know, the people around you. So you know, whether how that plays into the, I've sort of described that from an Australian perspective, but how that plays into China's narrative, that, yeah, I think that ends up being fairly speculative because we're not really there yet. You know, I think that they'll be okay politically with that because, you know, the source of the problem is the success in controlling the virus. As it gets down the track, if other countries are opening up because they've all been vaccinated and China's not, I think the only option is that they have to get vaccinated. You know, I don't think they can really count on the idea that there's, you know, the rest of the world is so thoroughly banished the virus that there's no risk. Right? If it comes in, it's going to spread. And so their options are going to be either, you know, this sort of continuing series of occasional lockdowns or vaccinate people. And, you know, you don't want to be doing lockdowns forever. It sucks.
Yeah.
You know, we've got one in Western Australia today. Is they've had their first case of community transmission in over a year. And you know, they had to lock down the city because there was no, I guess all the contact tracers have gone home. And, you know, so they've got a mask mandate and, you know, they've cancelled Anzac Day parade and things like this. You don't want to be going through that all the time. Right? You want that to end. That's the whole point, right? And if you Chinese people are going to be in the same perspective, I think, right? They're not going to want to be going through this over and over again.
I think there is an interesting question about sort of, in terms of the border reopening and sort of inward transmission and herd immunity and so on. I mean, there is, I think, a tension between different parts of, you know, public opinion and different parts of the government bureaucracy here. I mean, I had lunch with a foreign diplomat a couple of weeks ago, and he was actually saying that this was in a major city in China, that he was hearing very different things from different kinds of officials, both in that city and inland where he'd been as well. And he said, you know, some people, particularly more inland, some officials essentially take the attitude of pulling up the drawbridge for another year or longer. In other words, don't take the risk of opening at all, and if it requires, you know, sealing off and all the inconvenience that comes with that, then that's a fairly easy price to pay. But then, you know, in this major city, which is quite outward looking, he said most of the officials actually were thinking about ways, you know, can you reduce the quarantine, say, from 2 weeks to, you know, 5 days home isolation? Can you rely on testing and so on? Because they really felt that this was, you know, having a major impact on, you know, economic, social life, engagement with the world, and so on. So I think there is a a diversity of opinion about how much it matters whether you save yourself off from the world or whether a complex, open, modern society needs to re-engage with the world as soon as possible. I think in some ways this is a legacy of different generations, different bureaucratic interests and attitudes towards whether China can go it alone on things or whether it is enmeshed in the world. And I think also in terms of public opinion, this is quite a difference between China and some developed countries. I think in Australia, there's a very large segment of the public that is accustomed to pretty free international travel, and the constituency for reopening borders when it becomes feasible to do that. If you look at the portion of the Chinese population that has passports, travels regularly, and is actually being inconvenienced by this, it's much smaller. So there seems to be less investment in the idea of relative openness being the default as well. So I think we see some of these kinds of tensions playing out there. I have a slightly different question in terms of how success is being perceived around the world. If you're looking at the outward dimension of this and as a kind of soft power or performance legitimacy in the eyes of others around the world. Certainly during the last year or so, internal success or failure in suppressing the pandemic or letting it rage has been one very obvious yardstick of success or failure, I think, in the eyes of many people. Now, as we're moving to vaccine rollout and mass immunity and actually getting to an end of the pandemic, that seems to be another dimension which is becoming more visible. If you think about sort of Chinese Western soft power and perceptions of success around the world, do you see that balance shifting, in other words, from sort of suppression to vaccine rollout? I mean, do you think countries like America and Israel and the UK and so on will get more credit at the tail end of this for putting an end to the mass rollout? Or do you think China's narrative about success in sort of lockdown type suppression will remain very central in people's perceptions of what success and failure are?
Yeah, look, I think probably both is going to be the answer. China will certainly have impressed a lot of people around the world with the fact that their caseload has just been low all the way through after the beginning. And if you look at the epi curve, the daily infection rate from the beginning of last year through till today, the part where it's just in China is barely registering above the horizontal axis, right? You can scarcely see the period where all of China's infections happened relative to the period where all of Europe and America's infections and other countries have happened. And all that fuss back then about, is China's data accurate? Is are they concealing cases? Is it 3,000 or is it 4,000? I mean, when you're talking about 250,000 a day, it's just not statistically significant whether they would halving their caseload or what. I mean, it has to be a factor of 100 or more. So I mean, it's just impossible. I don't know the way China managed to do it. I think that they went in way too hard. I think that other countries, Singapore, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, I think got pretty close to right. But I also think that it's better to go a little bit harder than a little bit softer in COVID. You can easily adjust back if you overshoot in terms of hard. You can sort of relax a bit. If you overshoot, if you undershoot, then you've got a crisis on your hands, as many countries have discovered. But your questions about will the tail end of the pandemic skew who's perceived as competent, and yeah, I think that the UK is looking a lot better now than it was 6 months ago. So is the US. The EU is not necessarily looking fantastic at the moment. Squabbling over this and that, but and sort of controlling exports when they've sort of promised them, which is a bit mean because the UK and the US promised not to export, and so they're not held to that standard of right? The EU said they would, and now they realize they can't, and everyone's sort of filthy about it. But the US and the UK said they wouldn't, and so then they're not expected to. I think the EU is getting a pretty raw deal in that situation. They went into all those arrangements with the manufacturers expecting the US and the UK to also be freely exporting, and suddenly found that they were the only ones supplying the rest of the world. And I think that they're getting a bit robbed, but the perception is probably not going to be that. The perception is going to be that they've got a mess, and the UK and the US are managing it. And of course, the US and UK are going to be finished their program in a few months, and they'll be able to put their entire capacity into providing other countries with vaccines. And hopefully there won't be too many new variants that are immune to these vaccines by that stage. I think we're rolling the dice on that. We need to hurry up with this stuff because with the rate of new infections, you're creating mutations at a much higher rate than we used to be, and so the chance that we get an escape or a problem that we can't, that means we have to go back to square one with the vaccines, is constantly increasing. So it is a race. Maybe we'll win it. Maybe we've got another year of this or more. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, in terms of who's going to end up looking competent, the US and the UK are certainly coming up from behind at a reasonable pace, I would say, put it like that. And what ends up happening down the track, I mean, I'm not going to be making predictions, not after the last 5 years.
Yeah. A slightly different question about sort of, I guess, the different societies and how they respond to this, and the values involving the relationship between state and society, and surveillance and lockdown and these measures, which obviously have been quite controversial in some countries, and in many ways, as I said earlier, have mapped onto other political and social fault lines that predated the pandemic. It seems that if you look at certain countries and certain parts of the political spectrum, there seems in the West and elsewhere to be a growing comfort with higher levels of state intervention in the name of public health and public safety. And that certainly has been something which has been part of the Chinese narrative internally. That if you look at the level of surveillance and the health codes and everything else here, and then maybe elements of that being copied or at least admired to some extent in the West. Do you think we're seeing a sort of change in political culture where significant chunks of opinion around the world are becoming more comfortable with elements of a Chinese approach to society, the state-society relations?
I mean, I was going to say yes until you said elements of a Chinese approach. I don't think it's quite on the same axis.
Yeah.
Maybe of a more regulated or managed or public approach than purely sort of private, laissez-faire kind of, free-for-all approach that, maybe I mean, how in Australia the way it worked out was, we had a health emergency. I can't remember the name of the legislation, but basically in a public health emergency, the government can make a pronouncement saying, there's a 6-month emergency, and the health minister essentially becomes God, right? And whatever he says or she says, in this case, ours, whatever they say is important for managing the emergency. If they sign a declaration, that's the law, right? No other checks and balances. And they can do as many as they want within the time period available to them, 6 months. Obviously, they have to face the public, so and they are still serving at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. So there's a political constraint, but the legal constraint is if they sign it as this is going to help our response, that's the law. And so we had a situation where it was very easy to legally enforce lockdowns. Police would go around and fine people if they were, out of home for the wrong reason. And there were 4 reasons that you could be out. You could be going to get food. You could be going to work if you were an essential worker. You could be out on 1 hour of exercise a day, or you could be going to hospital. And that was basically it. And if the police stopped you while you're out and you didn't say you were doing one of those things in a sort of credible way, you'd get a $1,000 fine, something like this. You know, if you had more than 5 people over in your home and the police came around, which they would because your neighbors would call them for sure, you know, right? I mean, there was one situation where a 10-year-old birthday party or something, and they had 20 kids around and the parents, and it ended up being $26,000 of fines for this birthday party, something like this. You know, because everyone else around you is doing the right thing, and they don't want to be sacrificing while you're not, right? Because you're not sacrificing is going to get them infected or something, or extend the lockdown or whatever. So yeah, I mean, there was this tolerance for much more control, right? It was incredibly invasive in some ways, but at the same time, everyone understood that in aggregate, their freedoms were being enhanced because we were going to get through all this much quicker, right? I mean, now, since September or so, it's hard to remember there's a pandemic on at all in Australia. Right? You know, it's just not a thing because, you know, when it was a thing, we did the lockdown, and now it's dealt with, right? Whenever, you know, we still have the quarantine process. If you're an Australian overseas and you can't get home, that's definitely a thing. And every now and again, some infection gets through the quarantine process because, you know, nothing's perfect. And then you have to go through a bit of a process again. But for most of the time, right, that sort of general agreement and acceptance that you know, we have this intrusive process, everyone understood that it's increasing freedoms rather than increasing control. Right? It's the same with, you know, you go to a bar or restaurant or something and you sign in with your QR code. And, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had this app, COVID Safe app, that the government tried to get everyone to download, and it was based on Singapore's app. And they wanted everyone, you know, it would sort of, it was a Bluetooth thing. It would automatically log who you'd been near, basically. And everyone hated it. No one used it. It didn't help with a single case of contact tracing because it was just, you know, no one trusted it. But, you know, instead of that, we had this sort of sign-in sheet at any public place you went to. Anytime you go to a restaurant or a cafe or a gallery or whatever, you've got to sign in. And you can sign in with a different app, which makes it easier. You have to sign in. You can sign with pencil and paper if you want, but you can sign with the app and it's much faster and easier. And it's logging everyone who goes to these venues. And so everyone accepted that very easily. You know, so there's this different sort of inconsistent level of acceptance of surveillance, I suppose, and limitations on what you can do on freedom. I assume that this is other countries are going through similar sort of experiences of, you know, different things are acceptable to different people in different times, possibly. There's always some group who are less willing to accept it than others. You know, you get some people who make a big fuss and try and get into a place without wearing a mask or, you know, something like this. And inevitably it gets filmed and ends up on social media and, you know, creates a big storm. Yeah, so I mean, that whether that translates into a sustained acceptance for a more regulated society, I don't know about that. I mean, in our case, you know, the law is set up so that these extraordinary powers are time limited and they have to be extended. And because they're prescribed specifically to the pandemic, you know, they vanish as soon as it's over. And there's no mechanism for extending them necessarily. You have to pass new legislation. And maybe you can do that, you know, if the public thinks, what we really need is our own ability to make PPE in our own country, right? We need to make masks and vaccines here, and the free market isn't delivering it because it's cheaper to do it somewhere else. Well, we're going to do it more expensively as a kind of insurance, because we just want that reliability, and that will involve maybe some industry policy where the government, I don't know, does a grant or does a direct investment or whatever. And that kind of thing may be much more tolerated now than it was 2 years ago. That might extend beyond the duration of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think this question about the narratives out after the pandemic, sort of looking back in hindsight, will be interesting to see across the world. Because I mean, obviously in China you have this kind of official narrative which may adapt and pivot in various ways to define success as whatever has happened in its own way. I mean, I think in the West, obviously narratives are more diffuse and more multifaceted in society. One could imagine, people in the West having various kinds of stories about themselves coming out of this. It could be, depending on the level of political polarization in which camp one is in, it could be a story of mistakes that were made that institutions then correct, which is somehow a testament to institutional resilience and political ability to adapt and respond to a crisis. I mean, it could be a narrative about getting off to a slow start and then innovation. It could be a narrative about a broader shift in public opinion towards more sort of collective sense of shared sacrifice or regulation or whatever. I think there are many different narratives that may
I think there's a big difference. I think there's a big difference in Western countries of this sort of narrative to China, is that we don't have a single narrative. We have a whole plethora of narratives. In Australia, which political party is one set of narratives, who do you blame, who do you well, which, whether it's a state or a federal government that gets credit or gets blame, all these kind of things, whether it's the media or companies that get the credit or the blame. So there's not this sort of singular narrative that bends around within our context, whereas there is in China, because the discourse is so tightly controlled from a single source or a single-ish source. But if you're talking about looking back in a couple of years on where that narrative from China's success goes, I think you're introducing other events like the Olympics, which will have a big impact. In 2 years, I guess we've got Xi Jinping's third term begins, and how that transition, I don't know if transition is the right word, how that coronation or whatever you want to call it goes, will have an impact on this, and will be impacted by this, I think, as well. But probably the Olympics will be one of the big ones. Maybe by that stage it'll be more important than what's happening, more important in terms of narrative than what's happening with the vaccines now. I suspect. You're asking me to look forward into the future again, and this is not the recent history of that has not been very successful.
Yeah, what's the saying about the problem with the future? Is it so hard to predict or something? Yeah. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time. We certainly covered a lot of ground. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more twists and turns over coming months as the world works its way through the rest of this. But thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure speaking to you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Okay, bye-bye.